Hello, I'm Michelle Lavander, Director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today and welcome to our Health Matters webinar, The New Supreme Court, The End of Obamacare. Our topic could not be more timely. As we gather here, Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett is participating in her confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Her likely confirmation has thrust back to the forefront the question of whether the court could topple the Affordable Care Act, catapulting the issue to be one of the most important before the election. It's a charged moment. The court is slated to hear the latest legal challenge to Obamacare a week after the election. If a new conservative majority invalidates the ACA, more than 20 million Americans could instantly lose their health insurance. Up to 133 million Americans with pre-existing conditions could lose coverage, and 12 million low-income Americans could be kicked off the Medicaid rolls. And all this is being decided in the middle of a global pandemic that has even infected Republican members of the Judiciary Committee. Will Barrett side with Republicans in the Trump administration in overturning the ACA? She gave an early hint just hours ago about her belief in what is called severability, or a more moderate approach, where if some elements are deemed invalid, others can still stand. Under questioning by Senator Dianne Feinstein, she described the approach as trying not to undo your work and compared the judicial approach to a game of Jenga where you take out one piece and the edifice can still stand. Here to help us understand all this, we have two distinguished speakers, Nicholas Bagley and Joanne Keenan. Nicholas is law professor at the University of Michigan. He teaches and writes about health law, administrative law, and regulatory theory. His work has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, the Georgetown Law Review, and the Journal on Health Politics, Policy and Law. Before joining the law school in 2010, he was an attorney with the appellate staff in the Civil Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and he also served as a law clerk to Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court. Joanne Keenan, I mispronounced her name earlier, is executive healthcare editor at Politico, where she's worked since 2011. A Harvard graduate, she's covered health policy and politics in Washington for more than 20 years. She also wrote about health policy for several years at the nonpartisan New America Foundation. Her work has appeared in many publications, including The Atlantic, Kaiser Health News, the Washingtonian, CQ, the Washington Post, and more. We want to thank the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation and the Commonwealth Fund for supporting this program. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag Supreme Court. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Because we have many people participating in this webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A panel of Zoom. You could write us there if you're experiencing technical problems as well. And we will be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Let's start our conversation with you, Nick. You've tracked this case against Obamacare very closely since it was filed in federal court in 2018. And you've previously written that the case is a partisan stunt that's been roundly condemned by lawyers on both sides of the aisle. It should have been laughed out of contention long ago. So can you briefly remind us how we got to this point? You're muted, Nick.
It's been a long and winding road. This lawsuit was filed after Republicans in Congress eliminated the tax penalty connected to the individual mandate at the end of 2017. And when they did so, the whole point was to get rid of the individual mandate, to give people a free choice about whether to get insurance or not to. It was a consolation prize for the Republicans' failure to secure the repeal of the Affordable Care Act earlier in the year. And a bunch of red state attorneys general decided that that might have created a constitutional problem and filed a lawsuit arguing that the Affordable Care Act, back in 2012, the Supreme Court said it couldn't command people to buy insurance. That kind of coercive command fell outside of the scope of Congress's constitutional powers. But the court bent over backwards to read the statute as giving people a free choice either to buy insurance or to pay a tax penalty. But the challenger said, aha, there's no tax penalty anymore, and therefore no way to bend over backwards to read the statute to give people a choice. Therefore, the only way to make sense of it is as imposing a coercive command. In other words, their argument is that by eliminating the penalty, Congress made the law more coercive, not less. That's a ridiculous argument, but it's the one that they ran with. And they have since had some success, which is kind of not a shock in the sense that they were able to pick the venue in which the case was first heard by filing the case in a San Antonio court where it was likely to be channeled to Judge O'Connor, Judge Reed O'Connor, who's a known partisan judge who has entered lots and lots of injunctions against Obama-era initiatives. And then the appeal was taken to the Fifth Circuit, which is the most conservative circuit court in the country, where 2 Republican-appointed judges also sided with the challengers. The 2 Republican judges didn't say that the whole entire Affordable Care Act had to fall, but they didn't weigh in on that severability question. They just sent the case back down to Judge O'Connor. The Supreme Court decided it was time to intervene, and they did so when Justice Ginsburg was obviously still on the court. At the time, the center of the court was Chief Justice Roberts. Chief Justice Roberts has turned away too much stronger challenges to the Affordable Care Act, and so there was good reason to think he would turn this one away too. It's a much weaker challenge. But with Judge Barrett's confirmation, the center of gravity in the court is going to shift to the right. And that increases the odds that the Supreme Court could take an aggressive step to invalidate all or part of the Affordable Care Act. I think that's still pretty unlikely. The case is really quite daft, and the plaintiffs have to run the table on 3 very challenging arguments. But I think anybody who says this thing is a lock is wrong. Like, there is a small but real chance that the Supreme Court could do damage to the Affordable Care Act. And were that to happen, the consequences for the healthcare system and for the institutional integrity of the court would be really quite serious.
And just walk us through the basic scenarios of how the court might rule.
Sure. Well, thinking it through, the plaintiffs have to persuade the court that they have standing to bring the case in the first place, which is a tough argument because, the plaintiffs here are a bunch of red states, and they're challenging the individual mandate, the $0 mandate, but nonetheless challenging the mandate. And the mandate doesn't apply to states, so it doesn't cause them the kind of injury that would normally be the prerequisite for getting to file a federal court case. The red states recognized this problem, so they enlisted the support of 2 Texas consultants who claim that they have bought insurance because they feel coerced by the toothless mandate that's in the law. I don't find those affidavits to be especially credible, but their lawyer tells them not to talk to the press, and so far the courts have accepted them as if they were gospel. But I could imagine the Supreme Court saying, look, you don't have standing to challenge a law that cannot be enforced against you. And in fact, that's the right answer doctrinally. So, unless the court is highly motivated to hear the merits of this case, the court might turn away the case on standing grounds, right? Just never get to the merits. The court could just say, look, when Congress eliminated the mandate penalty, they didn't mean to coerce anyone to do anything, and thus there's no constitutional difficulty. So, like in that case, we're just going to say that they're wrong on the merits. And finally, and also I think a reasonably likely outcome here is the court might say, look, there is a constitutional defect with a toothless mandate. Congress can't go around ordering people to buy health insurance. But that toothless mandate, the language that says you shall get health insurance, can be severed from the rest of the law and allow the rest of the law to stand. And on this one especially, conservative and liberal scholars have generally looked at the case and thought, yeah, I mean, no matter what you think about the constitutionality of a toothless mandate, it can't be that Congress thought that it was essential to the rest of the act, because Congress could have and chose not to repeal the entire thing. So we know what Congress wanted here. It wanted the ACA to continue on, but without the mandate. And that's what the court should hold. So I think those are the kind of 3 off-ramps the court has to saying that the ACA is still in place. Alternatively, the court could say the individual mandate can't be severed from just the guaranteed issue and community rating provisions of the ACA, which is to say the protections for people with pre-existing conditions. In the private sector, private market, just in the individual exchanges. Or the court could say, no, that provision is not just wrapped up in those private insurance reforms. It's wrapped up more broadly with all the other things the ACA did, and therefore the entire law has to fall. So a wide range of different potential options, with the worst case scenario being complete invalidation of the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you, Nick. And Joanne, let's turn to you. And maybe you could just flesh out for us a little bit what's at stake. What are some of the basic features of our health insurance landscape that we've come to take for granted that could disappear if the court ruled against the ACA? You're muted.
If the entire ACA were to be struck, which is not the most likely scenario, but as Nick said, courts can do whatever they want. People forget how much the Affordable Care Act has changed American healthcare. They forget how their own benefits, even if you are not on Medicaid and even if you are not buying insurance in the exchange, it has changed how we get healthcare. It has changed how we, what kind of benefits we get. Things like covering our kids under 26, for stronger protections, even in the insurance market, in the employer market, those of us who get covered at a job, there were some protections against pre-existing conditions in employment and job-based insurance, but there were gaps and problems with it still. So we have much stronger protections. We have better benefits legally, or it has to be stronger coverage, fewer gaps, mental health parity. We have to have, we can no longer have lifetime caps. We can no longer have annual caps. Preventive care. If you go to the doctor and your kid gets their shots for free, that's because Obamacare said preventive care, certain approved preventive care, I don't get to decide what's a preventive. The U.S. Preventive Task Force decides what is a good, solid, evidence-based thing to do. And keep in mind, COVID vaccine, if we get one, you want it, and you want it to be free, or maybe an administration cost or something, but basically, the same way your kid gets their childhood shots, if you want to get when we get a safe, effective one that we can trust, that protection would go away. That's one of the ways, so I think that we've forgotten a lot of it. We haven't forgotten the pre-existing condition fight, because that stayed in part of our political bloodstream, right? That's a big part of why the Democrats took the House in 2018. Why the ACA didn't get repealed in 2017. So I think the pre-existing condition argument, that one sort of hits home, because it hits us personally, because so many of us or family members have pre-existing conditions, or we know that someday we'll have one. It hits our pocketbooks because we know it's expensive to have ongoing care for a chronic condition. And it politically, that one, that's the headline. But all these other things, if your insurance got better between 2014 and 2019, it's because of the ACA. So it's smack in the middle of the presidential campaign again, where we had not heard much about it, really until Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. And now it's kaboom, kaboom, pre-existing. Look at the Judiciary Committee hearings. I'm not sure how many times they've mentioned it, but it's got to be in the 9 millions. It's just it's free TV for politicians. And it's a campaign ad for everybody up there, and that's what they're talking about.
And just remind us, Joanne, how it would play out. Just go back to the pre-ACA days, because those are pretty distant days in a way. What would happen if you had a heart condition, if you were pregnant, and you were seeking insurance, or you were working for a small business that couldn't afford big premiums? And also maybe throw into the mix this idea of how COVID fits into this concept of a pre-existing condition, as opposed to a life or death matter.
I'm going to start with the COVID one, and then we're going to go back to, I think that this disease last year, almost a year ago, last January, February, we thought this was a respiratory disease. We thought it was a dangerous respiratory disease that could in fact kill you, but that most people would survive. And then we thought you'd be over it. It turns out it's not just a respiratory disease, and you don't just get over it. It's a disease that strikes, if there are neurological symptoms, what people are calling brain fog, confusion, there's kidney failure, there's not just acute respiratory problems when you're sick, but people are having more permanent lung damage. Not everybody, but some. There's heart damage. Again, it's chronic. It continues after you're feeling better. They're even finding some people who had really minor cases, they have heart damage silently. We don't know whether, we don't have a year experience yet. We don't know whether these ongoing symptoms, what people are calling long haulers, or the chronic, the potential for real chronic cardiac and respiratory problems. We don't know, is this something that will heal in a year or 2 years, or is it lifelong? We don't know if it's something that's going to be sporadic, that you'll have a spell of it and you'll get well again and you'll have another spell of it. We don't know. But it is not, it is not a once and done, I can breathe, I was having trouble breathing last week, that inhaler worked and I'm okay now. It is not. And we do not know.
What does that mean for the ACA, Joanne?
Because it's a pre-existing condition, so that if the ACA goes away, but the pre-existing conditions protections goes away, access to care, and there are a lot of subtle ways through something many of the people on this call have heard of, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, CMMI. They've been doing a lot of, those don't grab headlines, but there are a lot of experiments on how to make healthcare better. And part of making healthcare better is managing chronic diseases better. Your grandmother probably does not have one chronic disease. She probably has 6. And making the healthcare system, changing incentives, changing how we do things to take care of chronic diseases, of which now COVID may be one of them, all that goes away. I mean, one of the great ironies of that is some of the things the Trump administration has tried to do, including with kidney care, which has bipartisan support. They're trying to improve kidney care. Nobody's against that. Some of the drug pricing initiatives they've tried, they rely on these innovation center models. So even some of the things that Trump is trying to do that are not controversial, and there are a handful that are not controversial, they would be in danger or they would go away. So, I mean, if you wanted to change jobs and you have a pre-existing condition, remember hearing about job lock. We don't talk about job lock anymore. But if you had a disease that needed ongoing care, you couldn't go to a small business that didn't have insurance, or you couldn't go out on your own and try to start your own firm. People stayed in marriages because they couldn't get insurance if they got divorced. That was called marriage lock. It's only 6 years ago, right? 2014, that all these things went in, but they have really changed the way we think. If you lose pre-existing conditions, or if you lose these annual caps, if you have cancer, you can hit $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year. Those were common. Insurers, your policy wouldn't cover. I mean, the lifetime caps of $1 million. Nowadays, people can hit a lifetime cap of $1 million for certain chronic diseases with very expensive drugs that you have to take year after year after year. So yes, I mean, we've just sort of forgotten what, I'm not saying that the ACA is a perfect piece of legislation. It clearly is not. We have gaps in coverage, and we have affordability issues. Those need to be addressed. But some of these basic senses of security, these basic protections for people who are sick, at some point we're all going to get sick, right? Whether it's COVID or congestive heart failure or diseases that strike younger people, some intestinal disorders that can be lifelong, diabetes, heart disease. There's a long list. Before 2014, if you looked at some of the lists of how an insurer defined pre-existing condition, they included things like acne, and not all of them, but I mean, headaches and pretty minor sprained ankles that would then, oh, you had a sprained ankle last year, we'll give you insurance, but we won't cover any orthopedic injury for the next 2 years. I mean, there are all these restrictions. I would have been in big trouble. I'm always spraining things. So that security we have, and that Republicans really value that pre-existing condition protection too. There has been a political shift. Republicans talk about, oh yeah, we invented that. We're going to do that too. They have not come up with a plan that does it, but nobody talks about, nah, you don't need pre-existing conditions coverage. And that's a big change.
And Nick, I wanted to understand from you, if the court rules against all or portions of the law, would people lose coverage overnight, or are there some possibilities to have this not sort of steamroll us in the middle of a pandemic?
And the short answer is that it's complicated, but that the effects would likely be pretty quick, if not immediate. The reason for that is to understand that the Affordable Care Act, when it comes to extending coverage to people, is really, you got to think of it as like a big funnel of money from the federal government to individuals and to states. The money to individuals goes to individuals who need to buy insurance on the exchanges, and it offers them tax credits that subsidize the prices that they're paying for insurance. The other big funding stream supports the Medicaid program that the states administer for people who are brought onto Medicaid who were previously iced out of the program. Those two funding streams would likely stop right away, overnight. So what's going to happen? Well, on the private side, if you've got a health insurance plan, that's a contract, and the insurer is still obliged to honor that contract to the end of the year if you keep paying your premiums. But since the subsidies won't be available to cover your premiums, you may not be able to afford them anymore. So some people will be able to manage to retain coverage by paying huge amounts of money in premiums to cover, in order to make up for the loss of the subsidies that help them afford it. But others are just going to have to drop coverage because they can't pay for it. It just costs too darn much without the subsidies. So it'll be kind of a variable response in there. And the states could try to do something on the margins to prevent the loss of insurance, but it's tough because it costs a lot of money. And like states right now during a pandemic are seeing a reduction in their tax revenues. They're seeing their own expenses go up and their tax base go down. That problem is all the more acute on the Medicaid side. So many more people are covered under the Affordable Care Act under Medicaid than they are under the private insurance exchanges, right? So we don't talk about them as much, but Medicaid is really where a lot of the action is. And, Medicaid is expensive, right? Healthcare is expensive. It's cheap per capita relative to other forms of insurance, but it is expensive when you take all the people who are poor enough to qualify for Medicaid. So if you cut off that funding stream, then in the states that have expanded their Medicaid programs, which is now about 3/4 of them, right? In all of those states, the states would have a choice. Like either we fill in the funding gap and keep our people on Medicaid through the end of the year, or we have to make huge cuts in our school budgets or our road budgets to balance our budgets to keep these people on, or we just drop them. I think the numbers here are so big that most states will be compelled to drop their Medicaid beneficiaries unless there's a promise that Congress is going to act really quickly. The last thing I'll say about this is that, a decision striking down all or part of the ACA would probably provoke some kind of political response. And I don't know what that looks like. If Democrats hold the House, Senate, and the White House, you could expect them to come up with a temporary patch or maybe even a permanent patch on fairly short order. It would be chaotic, it'd be difficult, but you could imagine them getting to yes. If nothing more, just to reinstate the Affordable Care Act without the constitutional defect, which they could do very easily. If we have divided government where the Senate is still held by Republicans or Donald Trump wins the White House, I honestly think the likeliest outcome is that Congress runs around like a chicken with its head cut off, doesn't come to a deal, and we're back where we were before 2010, which would be bad politically for Republicans. But to be honest, they've not shown an ability to coalesce around a plan to cover people. Many of them, I think pretty much every single member of Congress has campaigned on repealing the Affordable Care Act. So a vote to reinstate it, even temporarily, would be anathema to them. I don't pretend to be good at politics. You might want to ask Joanne, because I think she's better at this kind of crystal ball gazing than I am. But I think it would be a hot mess.
There's a scenario where the Supreme Court would rule we don't even know who the president is, right? I mean, if the election is messy, really messy, we might not know who the president is, we might not know who controls the Senate. And if the court rules quickly, there really is a scenario. The court doesn't usually rule that quickly, but they may, who knows, right? There's no, we could have an incredible amount of chaos. I guess after 4 years, nationally, we're used to chaos, but we could have a lot more chaos in many, many spheres. Politically, coronavirus is still the bigger issue.
And we're talking about this idea that the protections for pre-existing conditions are really going to be hard for Americans to dispense with. They've become so important. And Trump realizes this, and he has said, that he has that one solved and he has it in the bag. And so, you know, how would you recommend, for example, that journalists, you know, report on that issue and you know, where are we really with the Republican fix if the ACA is overturned?
I think talking to people about, you know, making them go back 6 years and find out what, you know, the people who had caps, who couldn't get enough care, who couldn't change jobs, who couldn't get insurance at all because they had had breast cancer before, or they had had a chronic disease or whatever in their, which is a lot of people. Sometimes you hear 100 million. I think it depends on how you define a pre-existing condition, how liberally you define condition. It's a lot though, you know, it's many, many, many people. So I think writing about the experiences people have and, you know, gaming out what it could look like. I mean, the question just ran across my screen. I saw quickly, somebody said, doesn't HIPAA give us that protection? It's limited. It does give you a fair amount of protection, but not complete in the large, if you work for a bigger, for large employers. Smaller employers might not even cover those benefits, right? It's not a matter of, I'm not going to cover your cancer. They just might not cover cancer because it's so expensive. And there are also waiting periods. And yes, HIPAA provides some protection since 1996 for employer-sponsored insurance. It's not foolproof, and a lot of people could not get insurance. You know, that's why we had so many people uninsured. We've covered 20 million. The new enrollment period starts on November 1st, right before the election. There are a lot of people who have lost their jobs and their insurance, so we may have higher enrollment this year. So I think one way of looking at that story is sort of going back and talking to people, to advocacy groups, to medical groups, to the specialists that do a lot of chronic disease treatment, like diabetes is so widespread in this country. I think another thing to do is, as Michelle just said, you know, Trump keeps saying, I've got a plan. Well, he doesn't. You know, his secret plan, it's like, you know, Richard Nixon with his secret plan to end the Vietnam War. That worked for him. He got reelected. But Trump has not produced a healthcare plan. His executive order, if you saw that he just put out an executive order 2-3 weeks ago, was it, that I am protecting pre-existing conditions. All it says is, you know, I'm in favor of it. It is the policy of our country to be in favor of it. It doesn't actually protect a single person. So, and yet people here, we're so divided. People hear and believe what you know, matches their ideological views. So if you go out and interview people who support Trump, and they have a chronic disease, they will probably tell you, yeah, you know, he's got it. He's got me covered, but he doesn't. And I think if you talk to some voters who've changed their minds, some of the swing voters or the people who were Democratic and voted for Trump and came back, or reverse, I think you will find that people are concerned that this is really a big concern. This is a huge concern.
Yeah, I'm gonna follow up on what Joanne said. It has been one of my pet peeves, and it was more pronounced in the 2018 election. I think the press in 2018 did a generally poor job, not the healthcare press particularly, but the reporters who don't make this their central beat, calling out what was a pattern of lies from Republican office holders and candidates about their record and about their positions on protecting people with pre-existing conditions. I'm thinking here of candidates like Josh Hawley in Missouri, who put out, you know, commercials that, you know, with tears in his eyes, talked about the importance of protecting people with pre-existing conditions and about how he was ardently supportive of those protections. Josh Hawley signed on to this lawsuit that now threatens the Affordable Care Act. He's literally a plaintiff in his role as Attorney General of Missouri. And yet those claims that Republican office holders, whether it's Trump or Republicans in Congress, support people with pre-existing conditions often are reported kind of credulously. And the game there, and the thing you have to understand, is that when Trump says he's protecting people with pre-existing conditions, it's a deliberate strategy to persuade low information voters that he's on their team. And it works if you print a headline saying Trump promises to protect people with pre-existing conditions, Democrats raise doubts, right? Because then it's just, well, who do you trust? Like, you need to be clear that these are, in fact, fabrications, right? This is a different kind of political lie than we tend to be used to. And so I think there's some squeamishness about just saying, no, they are bald-faced lying about the direction of what it is they want to do. And again, like I want to say, like, I think this was a bigger problem in 2018. I think the press has to some extent woken up about this as the flailing of the Trump administration becomes even more sort of pronounced. But it's a serious issue. The healthcare system's complicated. And you can look at people's records and find out what they stand for based on what they support. Like, you don't need to credulously report the talking points that they say. You can push back. And I'd encourage you all, anybody on this call who's doing this kind of work, to please push back, because it is way past time to stop reading headlines about Republicans have a plan. Because as Joanne said, they definitely do not.
When you are reporting and you're talking to your state, whether you're reporting in this, your local state representative or your local or your state senators and House members, or if you're on national politics, it is a one-word question, a one-word question. When a Republican tells you, I'm going to protect pre-existing conditions, your one-word question is how? Because they have not come up with a plan. They have come up with some ideas that if you already have insurance and you always keep your insurance and you never have a lapse in insurance, then you can't be kicked off of it, your pre-existing condition. But that doesn't cut it for a lot of people. People have things happen.
And the Republicans themselves have not coalesced around that plan. There are a lot of white papers, but a white paper does not make a legislative plan. There has not been the kind of muscle put behind these initiatives that you need to actually move a piece of legislation, because at the end of the day, Republicans, don't care about this issue nearly as much as their political rhetoric would tell you that they do, or at least if they care about it, it's a hard pill for them to swallow because it's very expensive to extend health insurance to people. And they don't want to raise taxes, and they don't want to make cuts. And I get that. That's a perfectly defensible view. But then tell me that that's the position. Don't lie to me about what you support.
And I want to turn in a moment to asking both of you for your suggestions about story ideas. But before that, I just want to turn to a group that we sometimes, in a weird way, overlook, even though they account for so much of the insurance in this country, which is the 153 million Americans who rely on employer-sponsored coverage. So are they safe if the ACA is overturned?
Not completely. I mean, for some of the reasons that I said before, we just had how many people just lost their job in America? I forgot the number, but is it 20 million? It just
staggering.
So all those people, I mean, we have recessions every few years historically. This one is obviously deeper and more tragic and possibly longer. We don't know. So no, you're not protected, because there's no such thing in life as total protection. So there's the possibility of recessions, and then these other protections that we were talking about before. If you have employer-sponsored insurance, and yes, it's expensive. I pay it. I know it's expensive. Some of the protections you now have under the ACA, like covering your kids, until they're 26. That would go away. And those annual and lifetime caps that, if you're healthy, that might sound like it's a huge amount of money, you'd never hit it. But, get Crohn's disease, get MS, get cancer. There are these drugs and treatments, it adds up. You could hit those lifetime caps, and then you're out of luck. No more insurance. You hit that lifetime cap, or you hit that. I had a friend who she and her husband both had rare diseases. Expensive rare diseases, and every few years she would change jobs because she had to start the clock going again, because she was a really gifted person. She was always able to get another job, but her husband's drugs in particular were really expensive, and like every 3 years she hit that lifetime cap and she'd get to a new job and start all over again. So that's not why you should choose a job. You should choose a job. Those of us who are lucky, you get to choose a job that makes you feel like you have, and either you're making a good living for your family, or you love your work, or something. It shouldn't be about health insurance. You shouldn't stay in a marriage because of health insurance. You shouldn't, it should not be the dominant decision. It shouldn't be the decision that shapes our other decisions. And we don't have that now because of the ACA. Whatever, I'll say for the third time, I know it's not perfect, but that, you forget that. You forget being a 25-year-old trying to get your 22-year-old getting your first job, and you already have a pre-existing condition. How are you going to get insurance?
Nick, did you want to add anything on this point?
No, I think
So
Joanne
then,
nailed it.
so Joanne, let me just go to this question about story ideas and ask you to maybe start with something that's dominated a lot of headlines recently, which is that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected people of color in this country. And so how do you see the ACA being overturned, potentially exacerbating the kind of health disparities that have been brought to the fore? And what stories might we do about that and other topics?
Well, I think if you look at things like Medicaid expansion and the additional subsidies, they're called cost sharing subsidies that help lower income people in the exchanges. They help. It's not just you get a subsidy for your premium, and you can also get help paying for your deductibles and your actual care. It is disproportionately. It has not ended, but it has addressed the racial and ethnic gaps in our coverage. Black Americans and Latinos are more likely to be covered now than they were before. They are also more hard hit by the job losses that we're now experiencing. So with the ACA or Medicaid as a backup, if we lose that as we fight our way out of this recession, those gaps are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So whatever progress we made, and we have made some, will be blown up. Both because of the disease burden and the gaps in able to get insurance if the ACA goes away, or if the pre-existing conditions go away. Because again, it's not it's sort of a vicious circle of a lot of things contributing to these disparities. And one is those populations have higher rates of some of these underlying disease, chronic pre-existing conditions that make you more vulnerable to having severe COVID. So like diabetes is really prevalent. There are racial disparities in diabetes, and that then fuels the racial disparities for the coronavirus. It's sort of a one bad thing feeding another, and to lose the insurance for 20 million people who are just and it's also poor whites. If those of you who are in rural areas or in states that have not expanded Medicaid, or states that have expanded Medicaid, look at the difference in what's happening to rural hospitals. I mean, there are rural hospitals closing in all states, or most, I'm not sure if all 50, but across the country. But it's way worse in the states that didn't expand Medicaid because they don't have that revenue stream. They don't have a way of paying for uninsured people. If we lose Medicaid, those rural hospitals that have been propped up in the Medicaid expansion states will be in danger. So that's a good story. Another good story is just hospitals in general and clinics, and just what do you do if 20 million insured people and their ability to pay for their care goes away? I mean, not just do people not have care, but our providers, some of which make a lot of money and some of which are right on the margin, some of them get really threatened. The ripple effects, but those are good stories. Looking at your hospitals, looking at comparing if you're in a state, say you're in Kentucky has expanded Medicaid right next door, Tennessee did not. Looking at the difference in the finances of healthcare systems in those two states, those kinds of stories are also good.
We're going to open this up now to the questions that we see in the Q&A panel. I want you to know that there's probably more of them than we can answer in the time we have, but we'll do our best to go through them. I'm going to start with a question from Clara McCarthy, who says, I'm curious if you have any advice for local health reporters working in predominantly conservative regions. I don't want to lose conservative readers completely, but it also seems like there's so much misunderstanding about what the ACA has done for everybody, and Republicans in particular seem not to give due credit to the law.
Well, I mean, Nick, do you want to?
I mean, look, I sympathize, but like, if the facts are what lead you to lose conservative readers, like, I kind of think your fealty has to be to the facts. I think trying to be sensitive about the conspiracy theories that people are wedded to, or the sort of ideological commitments that they have, I think I think that way madness lies. I think you've got to call it straight. And Republicans, like, they just haven't been playing it straight on healthcare, and they're getting away with it. And they're getting away with it because of this hypersensitivity. Tell people, look, like, you may think that the Affordable Care Act is the root of all your evils. It's not. You may think that the Republicans have a plan to protect people with pre-existing conditions. They don't. Doesn't mean that the world's perfect. It doesn't mean that like everything is hunky-dory with what Obama did. But there are real facts out there, and just reporting what the two sides are saying about each other or past each other, I think does your readers a long-term disservice. I think it's what allows this current environment where people just don't believe what you tell them. I think it allows that to thrive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's in such a polarized environment where, everything is suspect, that we have so little trust. I always joke that when I came to Washington, Democrats and Republicans only pretended to hate each other, I've been here for 20 years and I've seen a bitterness and a dysfunction and a distrust, and it's permeating, it's really through our society. So you're not going to write a story, if there are people out there who believe that Trump is going to protect their pre-existing conditions, I'm not going to write a story saying, look at these idiots. I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to explore, and you should explore in your communities, why people believe this, and then find someone neutral and trusted which is hard to do because some people don't trust, to talk about, well, actually, it's like this. You want to help them. You want people to understand that they're not protected when they think they are. I mean, is the court likely to throw out the entire ACA? It's not likely. I mean, Nick called it a daft legal argument, right? It's not likely. But we're all here talking about it because it is not impossible. It became a lot less impossible a few weeks ago. Could they also do something narrower, like just get rid of the mandate? If they only get rid of the mandate, it doesn't really make much difference, right? Republicans can say, victory! We won, we made it, it's not horrible anymore. But if they were to get rid of the mandate and only the mandate, nothing related to the mandate, because in Title I of the law, pre-existing conditions and community rating and other protections and affordability provisions are very tied up to the mandate. But if they were only to knock out that sentence or paragraph or whatever the mandate has shrunk to, there won't be really any change other than symbolic. But if the law goes away, every one of us will be infected. Medicare people, you'll still have Medicare, but you won't have that donut hole will get big again. Some of these quality initiatives that I talked about, which you might not see, but incentives to give care in a way that might be better for you, as opposed to fee for service and just giving you more and more stuff that's going to cost more and more money, but doesn't necessarily improve your health. That could dominate again, because there are other laws and programs that are addressing that, but the ACA also addresses quality of care, and we don't fight about that so much. Republicans never tried to repeal all those experiments, not in a sustainable way. They never made a big, they understand that there's problems with how we deliver care in this country, but that goes away. So if you're on Medicaid, you might not have it anymore.
And Joanne, I'm struck by something you said in talking about how do you write about this for a conservative audience, that you find a sort of trusted voice. And it reminds me a lot, though, about the kind of conversation that's also played out in the media about COVID. And, is it real? How dangerous it is? I mean, talk about whether we believe or not in pre-existing conditions being protected. We have a debate right now about something even more fundamental, which is the lethality of a disease that's killed, more than 210,000 Americans. And one story that comes to mind as we think about all this that I saw was done about a woman in Louisiana whose husband came down with COVID and got very ill, and how she went on social media and told all her friends that it is real, and that the fact that she was the one saying it made it real to people who would have not believed it. And so, I wonder if there's maybe an approach like that for the reporter who was asking that question.
You have to treat the people you write about with respect. It's not our job to call people names. It's our job to try to help people understand things. So, I cover healthcare in Washington, and we live in a really polarized society, and healthcare is as polarized as anything can possibly be, and has gotten more polarized over the years, but it's always been political since the 1930s when the AMA, what did Franklin Roosevelt not try to do? Healthcare. But I never thought that I would get to the point where a mask in a pandemic was seen as a political statement. I mean, if you had told me even last January or February, when we were just beginning to deal with this, that that masks would become political, I would have thought masks would have become bumper stickers. We would have had the Biden masks and the Trump masks. And, there is some of that. And there are MAGA masks and there are Washington National masks and, sports and all that. But I would have thought it would have become more like a way, it didn't occur to me that masks would become a symbol of liberty rather than a symbol of protecting ourselves and our fellow human beings.
And I want to turn back to just likely scenarios. We've gotten a number of questions, including one from Andy Bressler asking about what if Congress, can you discuss how and when Congress could step in to moot this case, perhaps by enacting a nominal $1 tax with individual mandate, or could Congress insert a severability clause in the ACA at this point to moot the case?
Yeah, this is something I've been writing about for a couple of years now, to no avail, I should add. Congress could fix this tomorrow, right? It could add a $1 penalty or a $100 penalty. It could include a severability clause, or it could strike the offending language, the language saying that thou shalt buy health insurance. It's not technically difficult. It's a political challenge to get a piece of legislation like that through. I see a couple of potential avenues. It looks like Congress won't do it, and certainly the White House won't do it when they're in Republican hands. If the election goes the Democrats' way and they get both the White House and the Senate, then Democrats will have to choose whether to try to fix this case and spend some political capital to do so, even though it's not likely to succeed, or run the risk that the Supreme Court does something unexpected and blows up the whole law, which would really leave them scrambling. I think that's a hard choice. My own view is that this is a risky piece of legislation. I don't think it's very likely I'm going to get cancer tomorrow, but I have insurance just in case I do. The same token, I think we should think about, in a functional political system, this would be an easy thing to fix. The challenge there is the filibuster. So there's no world in which Democrats are going to have more than 60 votes. So they're either going to have to add the $1 penalty back in via reconciliation, which they can only do under fairly narrow circumstances, and that, or they're going to have to blow up the filibuster for all legislation, which is obviously politically combustible itself. So I can imagine them taking steps even before the Supreme Court rules to moot this case out. Will they choose to take do the politically hard work before there's a strict need for it? I'm a little skeptical. They've been really reluctant to try to moot this case out before, and I think they might just not bother and just roll the dice. After the Supreme Court rules, could they reinstate the Affordable Care Act? Yeah, again, if they have unified control of government. If they don't, yeah. I mean, I can't even begin to tell you what I think that's what that'll do.
But for Republicans, it's a real be careful what you wish for a moment. Because remember, in 2016 and prior to 2016, their political pledge was we are going to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And Lamar Alexander, when Trump became president, the Senate was Republican hands. Lamar Alexander and others, but he was one of the voices, were saying not so fast. We can't just repeal it. We need to repeal and replace it. So the Republicans struggled and struggled and struggled to come up with a replacement plan. I mean, among themselves, there was, blood flowing in the halls of Congress as they fought that one out. And then they couldn't pass it. I mean, they did not succeed in repealing. So if the ACA goes away and there's no replacement plan, and hospitals back home in red states are screaming, we're going to go broke, and doctors are going to scream, a third of my patients or 10% of my pay, whatever, are suddenly uninsured, and constituents are going to say, wait a minute, you said you were going to protect me. What do you mean my diabetes isn't covered anymore? What do you mean my son's cerebral palsy isn't covered anymore? What do you mean grandma's, I can go on and on. Mental health. I mean, our country has a mental health problem, and we have huge substance abuse and addiction problems. And some of the Republican governors, John Kasich, when he was governor, have really talked about Medicaid as a huge source of payment and care for people with behavioral illnesses and behavioral challenges, including drug abuse and substance abuse. That goes away. That's federal money going into the states. And 90% or more of the Medicaid expansion money is, depending on the state, it's 90 to 95. The states aren't going to have that. I mean, the repercussions, we could be here for a month and a half and not figure them all out. I mean, the repercussions, so for Republicans to say, whoops, you know, I guess maybe that's not what I want. I mean, I agree, the politics, right now the Senate, you know, I'm not on the Hill anymore, I'm an editor, and when I report, I'm not usually reporting in Congress. I mean, I think they would take them a month to agree that the sky is blue. So if the ACA were to go away, the political dynamic of, you promised, and when you know, where's my coverage? You know, Nick's right. They don't have to, you know, how do you get 51 votes? What if McConnell is still in the Senate Majority Leader? The House is Democratic, the Senate is Republican. How do you get anything done? But also the landscape, and that landscape is not just individuals. It's the governors who are losing money. It's the health providers who are losing money. It is a big deal, and that could change the political dynamic. And then they don't have to face the voters again for at least 2 years.
Yeah, I'll add, I mean, it's a kind of an open secret that the Republican Party as a whole would prefer this lawsuit to go away. I mean, you can see Republican senators walking away from it as fast as possible during the Judge Barrett confirmation hearings. The trouble is that individual Republicans can't let up. These attorneys general that filed the lawsuit, every attorney general in a red state wants to be governor someday. And that means they're going to have to win a primary with a really conservative primary electorate, which means they think that this ACA line plays really well with the Republican primary voters. And that means they've got individual incentives to try to torch the Affordable Care Act, even if they think it'd be bad for the party as a whole. And that tension where kind of the collective action problem where the Republican Party would like this lawsuit to quietly go away so they could talk about something other than healthcare. You know, Trump walked right into it by supporting this lawsuit and instructing his Justice Department to file a brief supporting a challenge to its own law. But it's been one of the very strange dynamics to witness. And, you know, we'll see how that plays out over time. I think if the Supreme Court does turn this away, a lot of Republicans will sigh a quiet sigh of relief.
And we have a question from Christina Key. How did Obamacare help Native American communities with the healthcare that was provided by the Indian Health Services? And she didn't ask this, but presumably part of this is, you know, what would this mean for Indian healthcare?
There is a title of the law, like Title 11 or 12, that made some change. Nick might know more about this than I do. There were some changes and improvements to the IHS under the ACA, but they do have different legal rights under historic treaties and things that set up the Indian Health Service. So the Indian Health Service doesn't go away. The Indian Health Service's problems don't go away. Yeah. But some of the changes in modernization might be rolled back. And I don't know if there's any additional funding.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, certainly not on the funding front or the regulatory changes front. But what I can say is you'd think that the changes to the Indian Health Service would be a discrete part of the law that could be retained even if the individual mandate were found to be unconstitutional.
That's something that Congress could maybe fix.
And something that Congress could fix. You could imagine that impulse being the kind of impulse that might lead the Supreme Court to back off from a very expansive holding that the entire law should fall.
And we have a couple of similar questions of, you know, how does this play out? You know, how does this sort of come crashing down? I'll read two of them because they're very similar. One from A. Hopewell, who says, can you discuss the likely timing of decisions and implementation if overturned what might happen to healthcare.gov and coverage purchased during the upcoming open enrollment period? Can SCOTUS dictate the timing? And then from Paul Heldman, if the High Court were to invalidate parts of the ACA, how would that happen logistically? Would the ruling become immediately effective or take place with insurance policy renewals? Would a special master be appointed to work on unraveling parts of the law?
Yeah. I can address some of those questions. The court is likely to issue its decision sometime in the spring. We don't know exactly when, if it If it comes to a conclusion quickly, it could be as early as March. If it's a difficult case with a lot of separate opinions, it could be as late as June. The court in the 1970s and before used to do things like saying, hey, our constitutional holding doesn't take effect for a given window to allow the Congress to respond. That practice has been more or less abandoned, but you could imagine in a case like this, the Supreme Court thinking about reviving it. So you could imagine, nobody's arguing it, but you could imagine the Supreme Court exercising its discretion to say that the decision wouldn't take effect immediately. I don't think that's likely, but it's possible. Once it's gone, like, how does this all play out on the ground? I mean, it's a clusterfuck. I mean, I don't mean to be like profane, but like it is truly, I don't know what the answer is. I don't think anybody knows what the answer is. I feel bad for the folk at CMS who'd have to rewrite all their regulations on the fly. If they only struck down guaranteed issue and community rating, how did the subsidies even work? Because the subsidies are meant to be channeled to people who are buying risk-rated plans that all basically cost the same amount. How would it work to send subsidies to somebody who's getting an experience rated plan, one that costs more if you're sicker, right? But now your subsidy has to be commensurately larger to cover the increased expense of that plan. Like, I don't know how that works. I'm sure CMS doesn't know how that works. Like the whole system just would seize up, right? Like a small thing, but like a lot of hospitals are getting paid, every hospital is getting paid pursuant to changes made by the Affordable Care Act. Like, how do you continue making payments if the thing that you are looking to guide how much those payments ought to be is itself invalid, right? Like, I mean, it's thoughts like these that make me sort of more confident that the Supreme Court really wouldn't go that far, because I don't think it wants to court that kind of disruption. I wish I could offer you a better answer, but I can tell you, and Joanne, maybe you have similar conversations. I've talked to very smart people who think about this stuff all the time. I think about it a lot too, and we don't know. We really, truly don't know.
I have a question for you, Nick. If they rejected on standing grounds that these individuals don't have standing, is that fast? Is that something that happens in a few weeks?
No, it would also be a written opinion. If you got 9 votes for it and there was no separate writing, then you could imagine the majority could get the opinion out pretty quickly. You know, like most of what the Supreme Court decides is actually not that controversial. Most of the decisions are 9-zip. It doesn't take that long. And so like, you know, like if you argue the case in October, it's not unusual to have an opinion come out in January, but those cases don't tend to, like, by definition, they're not hard. This is somewhat more complex. It's a lot more complex, and it's certainly more politically volatile. Whether you think it's hard, you know, I don't know. I don't think it's hard. I think it's very easy. I think it should be laughed out of court. And if there are 9 justices who all agree with that, then it could go quickly. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think.
And what if they remand it? What if they send it back to the lower court?
Yeah, so what the Fifth Circuit did was say, we agree with the plaintiffs on the merits, meaning the individual mandate is unconstitutional, but we don't agree with Judge O'Connor that the entire law has to fall, or we're not sure about that. We'd like him to take another crack at it and be a little bit more discriminating in his severability analysis. The Supreme Court could just say, you know what, the Fifth Circuit got this right. We're going to send it back down for Judge O'Connor to do a little bit more work, in which case the sword of Damocles hangs over the law for another 3 years while Judge O'Connor issues an opinion, the Fifth Circuit issues an opinion, and then the Supreme Court hears it again. And I'd be back here talking to you in 2023. I hope that that is not what happens, and I think it's unlikely. I think the Supreme Court recognizes that there needs to be an answer here. In all likelihood, it's going to say the answer is, you know, let it go. And the Affordable Care Act is part of our law now. If you want to repeal it, do it through the political process, but don't keep coming to us. But it's possible they feel differently about the case. We're just going to have to see.
So we have a question that's a little bit personal here, but I'll go ahead and ask it. It's for you, Joanne, from Robert Rodriguez, who says that he works in the health insurance business and that when this insurance was talked about by Obama, he lied through his teeth. Fact, you can keep your doctor and the health plan will save you $2,500 per family to lie. I don't want the government to control my health insurance and tax me even if I don't have health insurance. And he goes on to call you a socialist And it sounds like a bunch of people with an agenda, BS, with no facts or laws backing what they say. It's not really a question, it's more of a statement, but I don't know if you want to respond.
I think Obama's, you can keep your plan if you like it, if you can keep your doctor if you like it, was, politically really dumb, and it was not true. It was true for many people. Keep in mind that under the current system, if your employer changes your healthcare, if you've gone from Blue Cross to Aetna, you may have to change everything whether you want to or not. So it's not unique to Obamacare. I mean, I think many of us have experienced that. That was, I forgot what year it was. The Washington Post called it the lie of the year. I think it was 2011. I think Obama paid a political price for that. The 2,500 figure got sort of, from the economists calculating it to how the politicians talked about it. Technically, it was it was basically, if healthcare is going to go up this much without Obamacare, it's only going to go up this much with Obamacare, and that you're going to save $2,500. Once that came into the stump speech, it got truncated into you're going to save $2,500, or it got reported that way. I think it was I don't think it was helpful to Obama. So on that part, I would agree with you. I think it was, Obama was a pretty good politician, and that was not well handled. I think a lot of what was wrong with the rollout of Obamacare was they had what I've written, I've called it a try it, you'll like it strategy. Like they passed on 2010. They couldn't actually get the benefits out until 2014 for a bunch of reasons, some of which were financial. They had to keep the CBO score under $1 trillion, under $1 billion rather. They had to, it definitely be not a T there. And it also took time to build a website, which didn't work, but they spent several years building a non-functional website. But in those years, because we didn't have a benefit, right? You had a promise of a benefit, and Obamacare is really, really, really complicated. So in those 4 years between 2010 and 2014, they just sort of talked about it like you're going to love it and confident that you'll love it. And then a lot of things went wrong in 2014. A lot of the people some people, those numbers of how many people lost their health plans were really exaggerated. It wasn't that many. The person who wrote in, he may have been one of them. Health plans change every year. People in the individual market, there's a ton of churn. The number who lost their plans that year versus another year, it wasn't that different. But if you were one of them, it was disturbing to you. And if you were told it was because of Obamacare, it was going to make you mad. And in some cases, it was because of Obamacare. Not always, because we don't get into grandfather laws and all that. But I mean, it wasn't, not everybody who lost their insurance that year, who had to change insurance, was because of the health law. Some people it was. Terrible politics. And I think he paid a price for it. They lost the House and the Senate. I mean, that's a pretty big price. So, and the rest of his comments, no matter what I say, won't satisfy him. But on that, yeah, I think there's plenty of documentation that it was an overstatement. It cost him, it cost Democrats, it was mishandled.
Hope you're on mute.
I'm going to just go to a final question. I'm going to kind of combine two questions that are a bit of tea leaf reading. One really harkens back to Amy Coney Barrett's remark about it's like a game of Jenga. Can you pull out a piece of the ACA with severability? And somebody asks, what would that mean if pieces of this are upheld and pieces are not? And what does that mean to lose these parts? And another kind of tea leaf question, which is, if parts or all of the ACA are struck down, would it be easier to put in place a different system like Medicare for all?
On the first, the Supreme Court's going to struggle with exactly the same question, which is, if you think that you can't just sever this mandate and you got to pull down some parts of the law, the question of how many parts and which ones is really hard. The sort of narrowest ruling, if you're going to pull down some parts, would be to say only guaranteed issue and community rating. That leaves a lot of questions about implementation. I don't know how you do it, but that's what some of the litigants have asked for at different stages of this lawsuit. Alternatively, you could say, well, only the private insurance reforms. So the exchanges, the subsidies, the individual regulations of private insurance plans, maybe those go, but everything else stays. Another way you might say it is anything touching health insurance. So not only the exchanges and the individual insurance reforms, but also the Medicaid expansion. but we'd leave intact the new rules in the Affordable Care Act and biosimilar regulation, which have nothing to do with insurance. Or you just say the whole damn thing is invalid. I don't know what they're going to do, but they haven't gotten a lot of briefing on that question, and they're going to be pretty reluctant to freelance because it feels like they're legislating when they're kind of drawing those lines, which I think means that they're going to be attracted to kind of the two polar extremes, either to say that the individual mandate is unconstitutional but nothing else, or that all of the law is unconstitutional, which at least is clean, even if it's quite expansive. On Medicare for All, maybe I'll leave that for Joanne. Do you think that a partial or complete invalidation leaves space for that?
I think that we'll hear a lot more about it, but it took 100 years to pass anything that looked like the ACA with all the gaps and problems it had. The idea of, K Street is very well organized to fight Medicare for All. Republicans don't like Medicare for All. Some centrist Democrats don't all like Medicare for All. It's also, how do you define Medicare for All? I mean, there's not even a consensus on what the phrase means. So do I think there will be a intense effort to revive that as a path forward among a segment of the Democratic Party? Yes, I believe that will be on the table. Do I think it's an easy thing to do? No, it is not an easy thing to do. I don't think it's that likely. I think it's, I think that the Democrat Party clearly has moved left. Joe Biden's health plan right now looks different than Joe Biden's health plan a few months ago. His plan to open Medicare to younger people, his public option is quite different. It's much more robust. I mean, the party has moved to the left. We don't understand how this pandemic is going to affect our politics, and it's probably going to take some time it's affecting all of us, right? It's affecting every single person on the planet, except maybe Antarctica. I think that there may be demands for government to fix things, but I don't think that Medicare for All becomes a slam dunk. And I also wanted to say one thing when Nick said, if the court strikes narrow mandate, guaranteed issue, and community rating, guaranteed issue is the coverage for pre-existing conditions. I as an insurer have to cover you. So Nick does a great job of speaking plain English, not legalese, but that might help people. That's the technical term for covering pre-existing conditions is guaranteed issue. You are guaranteed that I, as an insurer, have to issue a policy to you.
So I know that we still have many other questions here, but we're not going to be able to get to them all. And so I want to thank our fabulous panelists for their time and their insights, and to thank our audience for all their really wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. We're going to be sending you all a survey shortly, and we'll ask you to fill it out, letting us know what you thought of this webinar. We're also going to be archiving this webinar, and you can access it later today at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Should you want to support our coverage on coronavirus and on health policy, such as the webinar we had today, you can simply send a text to 41444 and follow the instructions. We really welcome support for this webinar series, which is offered for free. And with that, I want to thank all of you and wish you a really wonderful day.